Today we're in week 3 of our emotions series, and we've talked about owning your emotions. Last week we talked about dealing with your anger. Today, guys, we're going to be talking about the fear mindset, how to overcome the fear mindset. Scott, you took the lead on this topic. So what are we talking about when we say the fear mindset?
Well, we're trying to drill down a little bit when it comes to fear. I mean, there's some good fear that you can have in your life. You know, if you are hiking in the mountains and you encounter a bear and you feel some fear, that's good because that might help save your life. The Bible talks about the fear of the Lord, which is a deep reverence, a sense of awe and worship toward God. Those are good fears. Yep. That's not really what we're talking about. What we're talking about is what we call the mindset of fear, and that's when something negative happens in your life. Or when you think something negative might happen in the future, you choose fear, or you choose to let fear take hold of you. And so this might manifest itself in a couple different ways. You might be somebody who chronically feels this way. You have a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress. You have a lot of fears about all kinds of different things, whether it's the future, just sort of general fears about your family, your future, what may happen, or I think, and this might affect even more of us, you choose fear when something bad happens in your life. You know, you get fired at work, laid off, a loved one experiences some sort of illness, and instead of turning to God, you turn to fear and what might happen, and you become paralyzed from that, or you get further and further away from God. That's the fear mindset.
Ross, what is the opposite of the fear mindset? As Christians, what kind of mindset should we have instead of a fear mindset?
Right, it's a mindset of trust. You know, where we're trusting God with the future. The thing about fear is we imagine, like Scott mentioned, some future negative outcome. And so trusting God with the future and trusting God with the outcomes of the situation is the opposite of this mindset. Now, the fear is an emotion. It's going to happen at times. And it, like Scott said, there's some good times when fear leads us to the right direction. But again, like with all these emotions, it's not the emotion itself that's the problem. The problem is how we choose to respond to the emotion. And we can let the emotion of fear create this whole grid that we look at life, not trusting God with anything.
Yeah. Scott, in your sermon, the first point is that this is probably your most practical point. You say we should fight fear by getting closer to God. And you talk about that the more you practice the presence of God, the less you notice the presence of fear. What do you mean by that?
Well, this is what God's encouragement was to his people. In Isaiah 41:10, God says, "Don't be afraid, for I am with you. Don't be discouraged, for I am your God." And so God's people, the Israelites, they had lots of reasons to be afraid. They weren't the most powerful country. They weren't the most wealthy. Politically, they were disadvantaged. And yet, God says, don't be afraid because you have the one thing that's greater than all those things. You have me. I'm on your side. And so what he's telling us is that one of the best antidotes towards the fear mindset is to practice the presence of God, to know more of God in your life, to experience more of God in your life, because God becomes really big and your fears become smaller when you recognize who God is, that he's on your side.
And when we do that, you know, to the second point, then God replaces fear with something the Bible calls peace, and the Hebrew word for this is shalom. And I think it goes a little bit further than probably most modern readers would understand.
Yeah, that's really true. And shalom in the Old Testament is more than just like the absence of anxiety. There's this larger sense of well-being. There is some sense of security in it, but more than that. So what we want in our culture today is we want all the fear to be removed. We want complete security in every situation. But we can have God's peace and this sense of his well-being and presence even when we're not secure. Or on the other hand, we can be very secure in money or in our job or whatever and still have anxiety, still have fear in our life.
One of the things I think is just really important to understand is that this peace that God offers us, the shalom, is it's a gift that he gives us. It's not something that we produce in ourselves or we kind of try to talk ourselves into feeling peaceful. John 14:27, Jesus says, "I am leaving you with a gift, peace of mind and heart. And the peace I give is a gift the world cannot give. So don't be troubled or afraid." And so there Jesus contrasts what we were just talking about. The peace that he offers us transcends what the world can offer, which at best is temporary, and it goes throughout every situation. And so therefore we don't need to be troubled, we don't need to be panicked, we don't need to be afraid. And so I think a good question for all of us to ask is my life characterized by this peace, this shalom from God, or is it characterized by anxiety, fear? You know, who am I trusting? What am I trusting in?
And then there's this last concept biblically that I think we have to cover on this topic because the Bible contrasts fear with love. Some leaders lead by fear, some leaders lead by love. And I think what Jesus does is he says, perfect love casts out fear, right? So it's a different approach. And I think a lot of people, maybe some of their fear, some of their deeper fear comes from not understanding the character, the nature of God.
Yeah, I think we've sort of been assuming throughout this whole conversation that you can come to God and he will help you with your fears. But what if God is the one you're afraid of, and not out of the reverential fear of the Lord, but maybe you grew up in a religion that was very rules-based, very works-oriented, and you had to be good enough for God. You had to make sure you jump through all the religious hoops so that you can be acceptable to God, you can qualify for heaven, whatever. You might have a very fearful view of God. Or even someone who's maybe not very religious at all, but they just feel like God doesn't care about them, God doesn't love them. They might be afraid of him in some sense. Well, with all that in mind, in 1 John 4, we read what you referenced, that there is no fear in love. Perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. And so what the Bible is teaching us here is that we don't need to be afraid of God. We don't need to be afraid of eternal punishment if we accept the salvation of God through Christ, because that's God's perfect love, and his perfect love is greater than our fears, and it's greater than that punishment that we deserve for our sins.
Yeah, so talk about the fear mindset and how to overcome it in your small groups. And if you want to listen to Scott's full sermon on this, we'll include that below. And don't forget to join us for our last message in this 4-week series, because next time we're going to talk about sadness and grief.